it is time to talk about what is happening on the ground. And we have been talking now about the framework, the judicial framework. We have been talking about collecting evidence, and now it's time to talk about the evidence we have. Maybe a short remark, and maybe Anton, you will then talk about it. Until last week, I think we were talking about Mariupol and Bucha and other places, Irpin. But now what has been happening during the last week, that 30, maybe even meanwhile 40% of the infrastructure is being destroyed, which means that you don't know how to get your people through the winter. I think this is an additional ingredients which strengthens the idea whether we don't have to talk about the prevention of genocide, but just to start with. Okay, now I want to introduce our distinguished guests. Some of them, we know each other for a long time, some we don't yet. Maryna Slobodyanuk, I hope I correct this, it's correct. She is the head of the investigation department, which calls itself Truth Hounds. Having a dog, I know what that means. You really have your nose on the ground all the time. And you are the ones who are having field missions in Ukraine. You are really talking to the people. And somebody talked about the fact that we are not the ones who should re-traumatize people here on a panel. So I think it is very good that they have somehow a medium who will tell us what you see on the ground. Iuliia Osmolovska, she has had a career as a diplomat and is chairwoman of the Transatlantic Dialogue Center and the executive director of the Eastern Europe Security Institute, and they are both NGOs, and they are involved in advocacy efforts and promoting the call for justice, which in the end means accountability, which we are talking about. Then we have Wayne Jordash. Many of you, I think, know him. For all his life, he has been a lawyer specializing in international human rights. And I think that you are now linked to Ukraine for so many years has a little personal reason, because he is married to Svetlana Salichuk. And thus he is, I would say, Ukrainian now. And so he is specialized on helping and providing governments, again, on the question of accountability. We have been talking before, Wayne, I know that you are critical about the question whether what we see now is meeting the criteria of genocide. I think we will have time to talk about that. And Anton Korynevych, also well known because he has been working on Crimea for a long time. He is a professor, and now he is Deputy Minister of Law, Ambassador at Large. Well, okay, Ambassador at Large. And he now is also working on the question of following a path to bring people to court. He is agent of Ukraine before the International Court of Justice, this ACJ we have been talking about, and allegations of genocide in a genocide case. So I think what we should do within this hour, is you talk about what you know and see on the ground. And you're allowed, you don't have to say for us, for our debate, this fits under the Genocide Convention. Maybe, Anton, you say, but still, at the moment, we think the war of aggression path is more effective. But let's start. Since February, actually, people who have been working in human rights know that within the occupied territories, the human rights question was horrible already. But we have a new status now with February. So why don't you start, Maryna?
No?
You could go ahead, yeah.
Yes. Greetings to everyone. My name is Maryna Slobodyanuk, and I'm from Hounds, and I'm very honored to represent the NGO sector of Ukraine. And believe me, we are very, very mobilized, like all Ukrainians now. So we document war crimes since 2014, and having dealt with all these huge amount of war crimes which have been conducted from that very time, we cannot only collect them and step aside from the investigation. So if you go to our social media pages, you will find there the notice that Hounds investigate war crimes. That's what we now do and what we tend to do in future. And now I will explain why. And let me dive into some statistic numbers first. As recently have been reported by Yuri Belousov, who is the head of the so-called War Department in our Prosecutor's General Office. Now only 10 verdicts of guilty has been delivered by Ukrainian courts on war crimes. 47 notice of suspicion also delivered by the prosecutors, and 188 indictments brought by prosecutors to the court. And let me make a pause here. More than 40,000 investigations on criminal investigations on war crimes launched in Ukraine for the moment. This is an unprecedented number, never happened in the history. So, and you could only imagine how loaded and overloaded the law enforcement and judicial system of Ukraine is now. So, as much as we are in a crucial need of weapon, we also are in a crucial need of help and support in investigating of war crimes now. Of course, different actors have appeared in the field of investigations, and we are very grateful for this. I mean, the ICC representatives, prosecutors of ICC, many forensic experts, many prosecutors from different countries. At the same time, many mechanisms of extraterritorial jurisdiction has been launched of recent. And I know that more than 13 countries, I believe, have launched the structural investigation of war crimes on that ground. But still, we need, like they say, the prosecutors, Ukrainian prosecutors say, they need hands and heads. And that's what we as NGO and other representatives of NGO sector are willing to provide. What actually we do not only, well, we cooperate in different tracks and in different directions. First of all, conducting the field missions and working with people in this mission. We collect many, many testimonies, many evidences of the alleged crimes committed. So we do operate like hands of these prosecutors, of these regional investigators, and collect their testimonies, collect these evidences, and just transfer to them for the further official investigations. And this also of great need nowadays. And also we can provide with some expertise, with some investigations conducted by ourselves. So from the very beginning, I suppose we transferred 40 investigated cases to the prosecutors, which allow them to make the official investigation in future, further official investigation. And from the full-scale invasion, we performed 10 turnkey, I would name them, investigations, which allow prosecutors to develop these cases. How do we do this? What is it look like? First, we go to the field mission and we talk to people. We find the direct witnesses of what can be recognized as war crimes. Take into consideration the high standards of admissibility of the evidences. We try to find out all the possible evidences, all the possible facts that can be combined and can be recognized in future as war crimes. So we ask people, what did they see? What the weather like today? What happened? Whether there were some military targets, some military men. It all influences on the further investigation. Of course, we make some photo footages. We collect all the possible documents that can in future puzzle up the picture of the alleged war crime. And then we go and do some cabinet investigation using the OSINT practices, using the satellite images, which help us also to corroborate these testimonies with some facts we get from outside. So we use different technologies, even 3D modeling to show, for instance, like we did in our investigation on the rocket attack on Mykolaiv municipality building, which resulted in deaths of 36 people, to show that that exact rocket could impact and do this damage. So by making all these facts all together, we show the full picture of the alleged war crime. And then step by step, we go to identifying the alleged war criminals, the perpetrators, using the open source basis, building the chain of command and trying to verify whether this or that exact person could be recognized as the war criminal. So making this and trying to make this full picture, we then transfer these analytical reports, as we call them, to the prosecutors. And in most cases, they either add this material to their criminal proceedings or launch the new one on the basis of these findings.
Maryna, Ukraine is a huge country. We just start to learn it. And the front is unbelievably long. And the territory that has been occupied is big. And the places where, thanks heaven, it could be freed, show terrible incidents. Plus you have the war within the country with all the attacks from the outside. So I guess you are working, your office is in Kiev. So do you go on the ground? Do you travel into certain cities? How big is the supporters? I guess it's not possible that 8 or 10 people having an NGO office in Kiev. can really make comprehensive research.
Yes, indeed, Ukraine is big, and pity enough, the area of our research has been largened of late. So we have to and had to strengthen our capacities, and now we have the team of more than 20 documenters who go in field missions, who work on the ground. And at this very moment, we have 2 field missions in newly liberated territories who work there, who talk to people. Of course, it's not enough, but it enough we are not capable to research all the sites of the alleged war crimes simultaneously. So it really will take a long time to discover all the cases, to investigate them, and to document. And that is the problem we really face now, and the prosecutors, investigators also face now, because people, they just forgot these traumatizing events. They can't live in the damaged houses, and the sites of the shellings are being rebuilt. So you have to operate very quickly to be able to document all these evidences and to examine them properly.
Klingt schon ein bisschen wie eine Mission almost impossible. Iuliia, wir haben eben schon gehört, dass die Koordination also eine große Herausforderung ist. Im Deutschen sagt man, viele Köche verderben den Brei. In diesem Fall kommt er vielleicht gar nicht belastbar zustande. Vielleicht können Sie neben der Schilderung Ihrer Arbeit auch diesem Aspekt noch mal ein bisschen nachgehen, denn offensichtlich gibt es einmal nicht ausreichend Research und Human Manpower and Knowledge, zumal die Ukraine ja noch 1, 2 andere Probleme hat. Aber es gibt auch die Frage der Koordinierung.
Yeah. So on the level of civil organizations working in Ukraine, I can't encompass the whole coordination network. And Maryna is a brilliant example of one of the organizations which is actually working in this regard, apart from professional teams of investigators of the General Prosecution Office, ICC, and military experts. But we also, a sort of very organic element in this collective activity of Ukrainian society, which could be constructed of civil societies, expert community, and the officials. We're working closely with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and our side is actually to transmit the findings that or the activities of our civil organizations to the international audience, for them to be able actually to see almost in real time mode, actually the atrocities that's happening in Ukraine. And definitely in this internet era, we have this capacity to reach to interceptions of the Russian militants or combatants who talk to their relatives to collect this. We also have a sort of a special YouTube with the Ukrainian journalists doing these interrogations with the Russian captured prisoners of war, combatants. They speak about this atrocity, their motivations. So we also have video documentary. For instance, I was striking very much recently when someone posted a video coverage of real shooting by Russians of Ukrainian people who were just then falling down into this big dig hole in the earth, so almost alive, and just lost their lives. So it was, this moment was taken. And when we decided as expert communities, which are working closely with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Defense, to disseminate this information abroad, we had actually to process all these facts and pictures ourselves. And it's, believe me, it's really very stressful. No one particular psyche of a particular human being could actually bear this. So it's really very decisive, but it is very important work that we are doing, because we managed to outreach to international media. We brought international journalists to Ukraine, brought them to these places together with our members of parliament and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, for them to be able actually to transmit this further. And with regard to our cooperation with the official authorities, we also taken up this initiative on special tribunal thing voluntarily on pro bono basis. But this is our part of contribution of responsible expert community to what we can do to actually bring this just peace and justice to the whole world, and to keep the society, international society, alarmed about what's going on in Ukraine. With regard to the new types of war crimes that currently is being investigated by the joint team of General Prosecutor Office and military experts, they indicated to us that right now, they're collecting findings that Russians are targeting deliberately agricultural facilities, agricultural infrastructure, which has nothing to do with the military targets. Because, for instance, if a farm stays far away in some place in the field, no military objects are close. So it's really clear that this was deliberate attack on agriculture field. And here we can remember also destruction of storages of grain of Ukraine in sea terminals, in seaports. We also can add to here the murder of one of the biggest agricultural businessmen, the owner of Nibulon, who was the hero of Ukraine. And actually someone detected, actually British journalists detected that prior to missile that hit a particular angle of his house where he had his bedroom, someone was just pointing with the light on the house on a particular window. So they actually hit this target. Another examples that we are talking about is damaging critical infrastructure, also with the view actually to make Ukrainian civilians vulnerable. And which is important about that, when we have these electricity cuts, because our energy is 40% reliant on atomic and nuclear energy, this disruption in communication also increases risks for technogenic catastrophe on Ukrainian nuclear network, ensuring this electric power. So obviously all these kind of new areas that our experts currently researching and compiling all the data for investigations also contribute to this vast list, non-exclusive probably, I had to say, of atrocities that Russians are doing against Ukrainians in Ukraine now. And just to complete, let me just finish with one phrase which was found, Russians wrote this in one of the rooms that they were used for these tortures of Ukrainian civilians. And the phrase was written like that: who allowed you to lead such a good life? So this is a testimony of Russians' approach to Ukrainians now. Thank you.
Maryna, you want to add something? Go ahead.
I would like to add, and I want to thank Iuliia for raising such specific types of targets of Russian military men. And I would also like to admit that one more target they specifically attack against is the cultural heritage of Ukraine. Churches, different sites and establishments of culture, which can also be a sign of genocidal intent. So we also have to take this into account. And we also witness this happening in Ukraine.
Is one of the ingredients of the Genocide Convention. Yeah. Jane, you have seen a lot of crimes against humanity in your life, or heard about them and went to law. Now it's within your own country, your and your wife's country. We have been talking a little bit about, does it meet genocide or not? But maybe with your wide and vast experience, you tell us a little bit where you are at now. Yeah.
Thank you for the question, and thank you to you and Ralph for the invitation to attend this panel. I'm very grateful. I'm not sure where I got the reputation of somebody who was doubting the genocide. However, I think it's too early to say. And the reason I think it's too early to say actually relates to what you just mentioned a few minutes ago about Mission Impossible. The number of violations, the number of crimes being committed in Ukraine, the number of potential war crimes, the number of potential crimes against humanity are huge. The prosecution have come out with a figure which says there's 40,843 potential war crimes. Now, actually, we don't know what that means. That could be significantly less. It could be significantly more, because what that relates to are reports. So is the siege of Mariupol one crime, or is it 50,000 crimes? So we actually don't know what that means yet. And the reason we don't know what it means yet is because the investigations are right at the beginning. These types of investigations take a huge amount of time, as you'll appreciate. You only need to look at the international criminal tribunals to see how long they take to actually investigate and prosecute crimes. The ICTY, the Yugoslav tribunal, which is probably the most successful international criminal tribunal of the modern era, they, over 29 years, convicted 91 people and had 111 completed trials. So you can see the resource-heavy nature of these trials. They're not quick, and neither are the investigations. Now, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why the international criminal tribunals take a long time. We can debate that for a very long time, but one of the reasons is because the investigations are so complex. It's useful to think of them in two different ways, or to having two different parts. First of all, the crime base. Now, the crime base is where most of the Ukrainian investigations are at this point in time. Crime base is as it sounds. It's what happened on the ground. It's looking at direct perpetrators. It's looking at the type of activity which is on the ground. Those investigations focus on the victims. They focus on human rights reports. They focus on the Commission of Inquiry, which is looking at these violations. And then the second part, which is the most complicated part, is that which we refer to as linkage. Now, at the moment, well, linkage, what is linkage? Linkage is, as it suggests, it's moving from the crime base, what happened on the ground, looking at the broader patterns, working out how those crimes on the ground are linked together, and then how the crimes on the ground, having been linked together, are then linked up the chain of command towards the Kremlin. Very complicated. International criminal law has struggled for decades with linkage. It's complicated. We all instinctively know that Putin is responsible, right? But linking him to what happened in Bucha in March 2022 requires a huge amount of investigation. First into the crime base, what happened in Bucha? Then, which was the commander in charge of Bucha? Who was his commander? What was his commander's link to, say, for example, Shoigu? And what was Shoigu's relationship with Putin at the time that Bucha occurred? That is months, if not years, of investigation. This is why I say it's too early to investigate or to conclude about genocide. Personally, I'm pretty convinced that in places such as Bucha and Mariupol, the violence escalated to the point of destruction, physical destruction of a part of the Ukrainian people. But in order to prove that, we need to examine the crime base, we need to have a look at the patterns, Thereafter, we need to track those patterns as they move from the 24th of February to March, when the Russians became very frustrated because the Ukrainians started to resist, and then to Bucha, where occupation became a much more of a stable situation for a few weeks, and where the level of violence escalated to what could potentially be genocide. And so I'll stop in a second, but Ukraine at the moment is overwhelmed with crime-based investigations, because every time a mass grave is revealed, for example, Iuliia, a mass grave was revealed a few weeks ago, 400 bodies in there. Each of them may have a different story to tell. Some may be legitimate warfare, some may be torture, some may be shelling. We just don't know. But imagine the person power it takes to investigate that, and that's just crime base. So we need to move beyond crime base, and it's not going to happen very quickly. And I'll just make one last point, because I feel sort of slightly frustrated about it, which is the international assistance. We hear a lot about how unprecedented the international assistance is. That's correct, but it's unprecedented not because it's adequate enough, but because it hasn't been adequate enough in the past. So it's unprecedented, but look at what's happening on the ground. The ICC prosecution have barely begun. May not sound like that when we hear the prosecution speaking, but they've barely begun. They've barely had investigators on the ground. The same is with the JIT, the Joint Investigation Team, barely investigators on the ground. Ditto with the investigations which are in the regional countries from Poland, Latvia, etc., etc. Barely an investigator on the ground. You cannot investigate these crimes. You cannot establish genocide without investigators on the ground, such as Hounds, who, by the way, do an excellent job. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Wayne. I just remember that it's maybe 2 years ago that I met a diplomat who told me that he's working in Rajak, and Rajak is Kosovo, and it was one of the mass graves that were found, and that they were basis for the decision to intervene. That was 1999. So we met in 1920, so it's more than 20 years ago. Gives you an impression how long it takes. And this was a mass grave with, I think, 128 people. So knowing that every village and every little town is freed, you find mass graves, you get an idea of what you're dealing with. Yes. Anton, now you are, as ambassador at large, representing the government, and we hear about the problems, which is not the problem of Ukraine, but of the international world, of the international society. Maybe you comment, your colleagues, taking into account also a little bit why your government is heading so much for this war of aggression. I have a second question. What is with all those peoples who left? We know that millions now are in Poland, are in Germany and other countries. They all have seen terrible things, many of them. Where is the record of those people?
Thank you so much, Marieluise. First of all, I would like also to start with words of gratitude to you, to Ralph, to Centrum Liberale Moderne for making this conference here today in Berlin, because it is important to talk about all that mass atrocity crimes and accountability and responsibility of both Russia and Russian nationals for all these flagrant violations of international law and international crimes committed in Ukraine. Maybe to start with a bit of individual experience, it takes now to get here 10 hours by car to Warsaw and 6 hours by car here to Berlin. In normal life, it would be 2 hours with a plane, and it shall return. 2 Mondays in a row, I was sitting in my office in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at 8 o'clock in the morning, giving lectures on international humanitarian law to my students in Transatlantic University. And 2 Mondays in a row, these lectures on international humanitarian law, on the law which is about how to wage war on the basis of international legal principles and norms, were intervened and interrogated by Russian missiles in one of the Mondays, and on the other of the Mondays with drones. So in such conditions, we now are speaking with our youth about international law. And maybe one of the last personal, I would say, intervention is that when we worked on Crimean issues for almost 3 years, one of our offices was in the city of Kherson. And that office was robbed by the Russian occupation authorities. I like the city of Kherson. I think when it is liberated, one of my first weekends will take place there. I'm sure that this time will come, but this is just to show that actually a lot of Ukrainians like myself, we do have, and we are millions, we do have these emotional things which are more than just professional, responsibility, but the thing that you are sure that you need to do what you can do in that circumstances which we have now. And of course, talking about all that mass atrocity crimes and being to Bucha, to Borodyanka, to Irpin, I'm sure that actually the genocide is there. And I think that of course, I am to support the statement by my minister talking about the case that I think that dolus specialis and the special intent is there. But of course, I agree with Wayne that in order to prove all the things under international criminal law standards, it takes years, I would say, in order to prove all these facts. I think that here, when we talk about genocide, we need to talk about actual genocide, yes, about also public incitement to genocide, and about such forms of genocide as, for instance, relocation of children. This is, again, something which my minister was talking about, because public incitement to genocide is for sure there. Just open in Google RIA Novosti and articles by Russian authors, and this is governmentally controlled media. What should Russia do with Ukraine? An article is called, or the coming of Russia and the new world. And you will see that, first of all, we do not exist. I mean, maybe I, Maryna, Iuliia, because we are Ukrainians, so we do not exist. We are not sitting here in Berlin, and that we should not exist, and that we are fake. So I think that this public incitement to genocide element is already there, and it can be investigated and prosecuted. And of course, such a form of genocide as a forced deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia, I'm sure that it is there. But it is obvious also for me that since we're talking today about the Genocide Convention, we know that during the international litigation history, there were some precedents and there were cases when one state tried to bring to responsibility another state for violations of the Genocide Convention. And these were very hard cases to prove. And that is why our case, as my minister mentioned, is about, in the International Court of Justice, is about allegations of genocide, is about the violations of the Genocide Convention, which are in the form of manipulating, speculating, and just confronting the very concept, the very issue of genocide. We were asked by a lot of lawyers throughout the world whether we would include the actual element of violation by the Russian Federation of the Convention of Genocide into this very case. We decided not to do that because this is another subject. And I'm sure that since genocide is a crime, this individual track of responsibility is very much more effective and can be very much more, I would say, proven better on the level of either the International Criminal Court or the national courts of Ukraine or other states. Of course, it is quite obvious, and we do keep daily contact with Prosecutors General Office. It is obvious that it is very hard to deal with such a number of mass atrocity crimes. And it is, of course, the fact that the international support and assistance is needed, because it would be an issue for any state, for any prosecutorial system. More than 40,000 of alleged war crimes committed. I mean, this is a huge number. So, of course, all the international support which comes in the issue of investigation and prosecution and expert assistance to our Ukrainian law enforcement is very important, because all in all, it is really important that all the perpetrators of all the crimes face justice, and that the accountability is there and is done. And I think that it is also important to mention that one of the issues which actually we touched today on this conference is really the fact that we, as Federal Minister mentioned, need to use all the existing tools and mechanisms to bring perpetrators to responsibility. And we as Ukrainian government are doing this since 2014. We use pretty much each and every international court and tribunal available for us. International Court of Justice, European Court of Human Rights, Ministry of Justice is here, Madam Vice Minister. International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, arbitrations under United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, private arbitrations, whatever, a recognition of jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. So we do use these all possible existing legal tools, but we see that they are not enough. And that is why, as you know, in particular, our president, His Excellency Volodymyr Zelensky, came up with this idea that there should be a comprehensive system of accountability, and that Ukrainians' position is that we need to add to all the existing international legal tools at least two more elements. The first is the compensation mechanism for damage caused during the Russian aggression, and the second is a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Since we had such brilliant interventions by Professor Kress and Judge Goldstone, I will not talk much about the special tribunal issue. My both personal position and professional task is to make the tribunal happen sooner than later. But I think that it is very important to once again make an emphasis on the thing which Wayne was talking about. Linkage between a particular crime in Bucha and the guy who sits in Kremlin. How many years it will take for any investigation to prove that that guy is responsible? And that guy is doing that since 2014. And he feels total impunity, and he thinks, he considers that he can do whatever he wants. We should not let this happen today in Europe or in any other place in the world. So I'm sure that the special tribunal, being of course a political matter, it is important to get those on the top of the tree responsible, not in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, but quite soon. So that is why we are working on this project. We are advocating for this tribunal, and we are sure that it is an important issue on prevention. Actually, Marieluise today talks a lot about prevention of genocide, but I think that this preventative function is important for all the international crimes. There shouldn't be the case that one day, one guy in some state gets up from the bed and decides to attack another state, because he does have a background that other guys did that, and they face no justice. So that is why we are doing this, and we hope for support of international community.
Yeah. Thank you, Anton. I think, again, since for us, Bosnia was such a deep first impression, because it really was within Europe, which had the feeling we will live in peace. We had the first disappointment. I remember when the debates started about having a tribunal, we thought, come on, you guys, we have different problems than bringing people like Milosevic to trial will never happen. And to be honest, thinking about the idea that Putin might be sitting in a courtroom, hard to believe, but nobody knows. And this collecting at the moment, I think, is very important. I have one more question. Since Mariupol was one of those, I mean, it's unbelievable atrocities which were taking place under the eyes of the public. This was also with that, like that with Sarajevo, but we did not have the time of SMS yet. We did not have mobile phones yet. Now we had every minute we had coverage. Not about the mass graves then. Will there be possibilities even now, even when it is not freed yet, to get material impressions of what happened in Mariupol? Maybe Wayne, whoever can answer the question, go ahead, Maryna.
I met with refugees from Mariupol and interviewed them in person, and believe me, what has been discovered is not even a tenth part of the whole picture that happened there. And what we really face is that the Russians try to hide all the sides of these horrible massacres. And maybe some evidences will never be found. So it's very crucial for us now to find these people in Europe as well, because most of them, the victims and witnesses of deportations, of this horrible filtration camps they went through, they finally got, most of them, and many of them, to Europe. And it's really crucial to meet with these people, to work in the ground here in Europe, to coordinate efforts of all actors who can do this, just to collect all the possible evidences, because they really are plenty of them. And we have to, since we do not have any access to the area, to Mariupol, and since we know that all the signs of the atrocities, of the hostilities are in the progress of hiding, of destroying, we have to communicate with the witnesses. We have to document and fixate these proofs. So this is what I would like to highlight being here in Europe, and thank you for raising this question.
Yeah, I agree with Mariana. In fact, my organization is being supported by the Netherlands to look into the attack on Mariupol, in particular to look at it as at least the siege of Mariupol, and to investigate exactly what happened. And I think, of course, it would be easier to do if you could have access to the territory, but I think it's perfectly possible to do without access to the territory. We have open source information, we have satellite imagery, we have mobile phones. And as Mariana noted, we have refugees who left Mariupol. The Russians can hide, excuse the terminology, they can hide the bodies, but inferences can be drawn. We know how many people were living in Mariupol. We can map how many people were there. We can, in time, work out who left and who didn't leave, where they went and where they might be, and whether they may be dead now. These are, I think, normal challenges for international criminal law. As I said, difficult challenges, but I think made much easier in the modern electronic era. So I would fully expect Mariupol, irrespective of whether it stays under Russian control, to be investigated in due course.
I just want to add to Maryna and Wayne that in Ukraine, we often say that, of course, for us, the places of biggest mass atrocity crimes are now Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, Izium, because everything can be investigated there on site. But we do often add that this is while we still don't know what exactly might and could have happened in Mariupol. we do believe, I mean, I think that this is both for governmental sector and for expert society, that Mariupol is really one of the most grievous examples of crimes. And these 10,000s of civilians killed there may be actually the example of genocide against Ukrainians living there in that region. And I do hope and I do believe that whenever ICC, International Criminal Court, needs to be active over the situation in Ukraine, it is quite obvious. The case of Mariupol should be one of the first priorities for the Office of the Prosecutor's investigation.
Yeah, I give you the word in a second. All I wanted to do is all of you who want to have an impression of the first analysis about Mariupol should look into Osteuropa. I think many of you know that editorial, which comes once a month, and this is where Professor Tomushat very early and very precise made his analysis of, at that time, we could know what's happening in Mariupol.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. I just want to highlight also very important issue that we're talking now about Mariupol, about Izium, about Bucha, Irpin, because we already have access to, at least access to these territories, and Mariupol was covered actually in almost a lifetime. But think ahead, we still have Kherson, which we don't know. And we do know that Russians are already mined hydroelectric power station in Kakhovka in order just to blow up the defense and for the whole area to be just covered with water, and all the other places and cities that will be liberated by Ukrainians, what we will discover then so far. So definitely, I'm not a lawyer. I can't tell you whether it's completes with the legal qualifications of genocide, but as a Ukrainian, as a patriot of my country, I'm definitely determined it is there. And about children, I just forgot to mention, and you're talking about taking these witnesses, a great number of children have become mute, actually, after all they've seen. And we were dealing with cases like a 6-year boy who buried his mom in Mariupol, and he kept coming to the grave, bringing some pieces of food afterwards, just to feed his mom when she was already dead. Or the other boy that we discovered in Kiev, 9 years of age, every day within 2 months, he was taken by Russian soldiers to their yard, pretending that they were just about to kill him every day. So this guy got muted as well, and we had to seek for allowances of psychological assistance to him. Then the girls that currently now in Mariupol, in Poland, and also there were efforts to take some evidence of them. They were taken from Bucha, 14 years girls, and they also become mute. So this is the level and the aspect of these atrocities which covers future generations of Ukrainians. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. I will hand over to you immediately. One other aspect we have to touch here. This is about deportation. We talked about forced adoption already, deportation. It's interesting that Russia is not hiding the numbers, somehow even making them bigger than they are according to your government. Do you have access to people there? Can they leave? Are they brought into places where they are forced to stay? Maybe 1, 2 more information about that, and then it's going to be your turn.
Actually, it's an area which I think needs a lot more investigation. I think it's difficult for the average civil society organization, and also difficult for the Prosecutor General's office to investigate, because it requires such a myriad of different sources of information, ranging from what happened, for example, in Mariupol when the Russians opened up so-called humanitarian corridors which forced people into Russia. So it requires examination of what happened in Ukraine, but it also requires examination of what happened in Russia. it seems it's a mystery to me thus far, because what you seem to have is a brutal filtration system. You certainly have abduction of children and you have abduction of men, but you also have some peculiarities, such as Ukrainians being allowed to return to Ukraine, providing they can find the resources to get back to Ukraine, which involves, I think, getting in touch with friendly Russian civil society actors who provide finances and routes through to the Baltic countries. So there's a sort of a mixture of terrible force, terrible abductions, but also a sort of slightly disorganized system where the Russians will turn around sometimes and allow even men to return back to Ukraine. So again, I think we need a lot more investigation. I think it's going to be one of the most difficult things to investigate because it requires such a breadth of expertise across both countries.
I think if we still could, if Memorial still could work in Russia, you would have NGOs there that would do some of the investigation.
Well, you do have them, actually. You still have some great organizations, I think, which are working either quietly in Russia or have intelligence sources within Russia. And I think there's a few of them which are operating pretty covertly and very effectively, I would say. And they are critical to these investigations.
Mona, I see your hand raised over there.
Yes, look, Andre Heermeyer is my name. I'm a former Minister for Police and Emergency Services and Corrections in the state of Victoria in Australia. So I used to deal with garden variety crime, not crime committed by superpowers with nuclear weapons. And my question is essentially, we're talking about bringing people to justice. Having the evidence is important, but how do you actually, you know, we had the example of Serbia, NATO going in and basically bringing some of the actors in Serbia to justice is a very different thing to bringing the Russian leadership to any form of justice before any form of international tribunal. The only ways I either see that happening is, well, firstly, I think, you know, the idea that that Western powers, that NATO, that any international force is going to go into Russia. I see Ukraine forcing Russia out of Ukraine. I don't see anybody going into Russia after that to drag these people out. The only way that's going to happen is if there is some sort of power shift, power change in Russia. I don't see that coming from a popular revolution. I see that from the power elites within Russia effectively changing the regime. But that is only going to happen, in my eyes, if there is enough, if they are squeezed hard enough economically and in other ways that we can do that aren't necessarily militarily. I don't know how your panel sees that.
Well, maybe, of course, it's a very relevant question. And I do think that, first of all, we can look how these things were dealt with in the history a bit. And we may see that already in 1942, from the London St. James Declaration, the whole process started. It took several years, but it had to be started. So I think that now, since, yes, it's active hostilities, we need to do this job because the day X might come and we need to have this preparatory base. This is the first issue. Maybe the second issue is that this is also one of the arguments why we advocate for the special tribunal for the crime of aggression, because crime of aggression is much more easier to prove. You don't need so many linkages and I mean, a lot of things are available and a lot of resolutions of international organizations already deemed that this is aggression, apart, of course, from resolution of UN Security Council because of veto of the Russian Federation. You may find already the model indictments for the crime of aggression committed by the Russian leadership against Ukraine. And this is rather expert level materials. So it means that a company of lawyers may produce such an indictment, I don't know, in several months. So it means that this job has to be done. But of course, we need to, with the help of international community, to put as much pressure on Russia as it can be. This is not a legal issue, not an issue of this panel discussion, but so many military vehicles and equipment as it can be, so many sanctions as it can be, for them not to feel themselves comfortable to wage this war, to continue waging this war. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to add that we don't have to be such, I don't know, maybe addicted with the numbers or with the high rank of the generals who can be recognized as, or who are the alleged war criminals. Every and each ordinary private can do and can commit the war crime. So we also, and we met with cases and documented cases where a small village and I don't know, maybe 4 or 3 people were killed or tortured to death by the Russian soldiers. And these cases has also to be put in justice and has also to be investigated, because not only the high rank evil has to be punished, but every and each case of this evil has to be investigated. And that's what we do. That's why we go to the faraway villages and speak to people in the ground, because who knows? Of course, we don't mind when Russian war criminals are killed in the battlefield, because they are soldiers, they are invaders. But what we want to gain is to find, identify, and punish them in a very duly way.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, but it's very necessary to actually answer these 2 reservations that you've been hearing a lot about. First, how do you see, can you envisage bringing Putin personally into court? So to our mind, it's not necessary actually to think about physical presence of Putin, but actually about the very act of political will to set up this special tribunal on Russia, on Russian political leadership, and actually just signal that we are determined to bring you to account. That would be enough, even psychologically, for Russian political leadership to understand that he wanted to be in the history as a great emperor, and he might end as the war criminal. First. Second political implication is that this might also be a discouragement mechanism for some other people in his team who might not be like seen war criminals, because they would like to live a good life afterwards and travel somewhere, not being just jailed in some very good country in Europe. And the last one on political relations, also I'm personally very skeptical. How can you plan of having some diplomatic and political relations with Putin team already now after what we've done so far? So it's already a question which to me is obsolete, actually. We don't have any diplomatic relations with Russia, and we would like probably more countries to consider this perspective as well. Thank you.
Wilfried.
Hello, Wilfried Jilge, my name. I'm an historian, have been working also a long time on Ukraine's history of Second World War, genocide, Holodomor, and I have a question to you. I think there is a danger now. We should not get stuck in the discussion of genocide. We have to resolve that question. But the problem is at now already that actually in Germany, people have so much information from facts on the ground, and they lose the orientation what is happening by qualitative. Yes. And I think it would be already now very important to make analyses to qualify what we know already. One example, and then my question to Maryna and to Wayne. What reminds me the things which are going on in Ukraine? It reminds me to the policy of Stalinism against Poland after the September 1939. So I think what we can now say is that Russia tries to cut off the head of Ukraine in order to destroy a political nation. But the political nation is not the term in the Genocide Convention. That was already a big discussion already in other cases with Cambodia, with other things. So my question to you, what do we know now when it comes to the persecution of key elites in the regions which are occupied by the Russians? So can we say there is a clear tendency to persecute opinion leaders, to persecute the bearers of Ukrainian nation? I think that would be a very important first step, actually, as an information in Germany and in Western Europe. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And my quick answer is, yes, we do a lot. We really documented multiple cases of the head of communities, of the activists being captured, tortured, and killed because of their active positions, because of their being patriotical, because of their being the good authority among the community. So by no other mean, this is the clear intent of the occupants to do so. And this is the undoubtful pattern of their actions on the occupied territories. We do have these testimonies.
And I would add to that. I completely agree with that, and I would, and I like the premise of your question, which is genocide somewhat distracting? Because I think we should look at genocide as the end result of an escalating campaign of persecution. That's why I think it might have occurred in Bucha. That's why it may have occurred in Mariupol. I think you have to map the patterns, and the patterns, I would say, are relatively clear, is that the Kremlin is engaged in a campaign of persecution, which involves, which is premised, I think, on two misconceptions, probably many misconceptions, but two relevant to this question. One is that by chopping off the head of the civil society, somehow civil society will then fall into place and do whatever the Russians or Putin wants them to do. And the second is, and this is, I think, part of this campaign, is essentially to terrorize the remaining civilian population. So I think it's a two-track. One, you destroy the leaders. Two, you terrorize the remaining civilian population, and hey presto, according to Putin's logic, the Ukrainians will fall into line. I think we all know that's complete misapprehension. I think when the Russians, such as in Bucha or Mariupol, realize that that does not work, we then potentially move to okay, if you're not going to fall into line, we'll destroy you physically then.
Just a small addition. I'm perfectly aware that in Kherson that happened, and that happens. And then it happens in Crimea for 8 years. In several days, there will be the first parliamentary summit of Crimea platform in Zagreb, in Croatia. And Nariman Jilalov, one of the leaders of Crimean Tatar people, is in jail for, I think, 17 years for coming to Crimea Platform Forum last August 2021. And there are so many such Crimean Tatars, Ukrainian citizens, and Ukrainians ethnical. And please don't forget that one of our cases in the ICJ, which Professor Kress was talking about, is actually about the violation of the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination against Crimean Tatars and ethnic Ukrainians in Crimea, by Russians, of course.
So they literally chop off heads.
I think the conductor of Kherson was shot dead when he refused to take part in an orchestra which was Russianized. Yeah. Irina? And then Adrian.
Irina Slonenko from Centrum Liberale Moderne. I have a question mostly to Maryna, but maybe other speakers can comment. You mentioned your organization, and Wayne mentioned there are hardly any investigators on the ground from abroad. I wonder if there are more organizations like yours in Ukraine doing this job. I've heard about the coalition, so I would like to understand the scope of work being done. And also I wonder if there is any training going on. I mean, you can train people to interview witnesses, I don't know, to do some field job, because as far as I understand, we need really have too few people, and there are a lot of crimes we need to investigate. So is there anything happening in this direction? Also, I wonder if you have any direct contacts to Russian human rights organizations. So Wayne already mentioned there are such organizations. I also heard of some who help like people from Mariupol to get to Baltic states and then further to Germany. And if you have direct contacts and cooperation with them. So that was it. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, indeed, we are the member of these 5 AM coalitions of different NGOs of Ukraine, and we try to coordinate and combine our efforts in documenting as well. That is why we do, as Truth Hounds, conduct trainings on documenting, and we see a good demand and request from different organizations. So I don't want it to become a vanity fair, you know, as soon as we can document, we will be solely documenting. So it's very urgent and very important to learn and to study for these NGOs who work in field, how to document properly, how to make good testimonies, evidence is admissible. So this is our, one of our goals is to train people, to train documenters, and to make this pool wider and more expertized. Yes, we do so. And answering your question on the contacts with Russian human rights organization, we have contacts with Memorial and cooperate with some of the exile members of them. And maybe that's all, as soon as I know.
Let me add something, if I can, to the training. I mentioned, of course, that Truth Hounds is, without a doubt, one of the, if not the leading civil society, I think, documenting group. And there are lots of groups, and of course, their abilities vary quite considerably, of course, with Truth Hounds, I think, leading, but some who have just picked up the task and are doing their best, but really are not doing it in the right way and not in a helpful way. But the bigger problem, I think, is for Ukraine is none of it's systematized at the moment. Now, if you, for example, look at the ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal, and you look at the Serb cases, the cases against the Serb accused. Now, most of them were prosecuted on a particular theory, which is based upon the pattern of the crimes. And what do I mean by that? The average indictment would say, you, Milosevic, persecuted the non-Serbs in order to forcibly remove them from Serb-claimed territory in order to create a greater Serbia. That's the theory of crimes. And so every investigator within the ICTY was aware of that. They built a specialization around that theory. They're investigating murder as part of persecution. They're investigating torture. So every investigator, every prosecutor is working and marching to the same song. What you have in Ukraine is actually none of that at the moment. You have just a huge number of organizations, and the prosecution are the same, essentially investigating according to what that particular crime looks like. So the sooner, in my view, there is an agreement and coordination across civil society and the prosecution as to the theory of the crimes, and the gentleman's comment there about a campaign of persecution, for me, it's either a campaign of persecution or a campaign of terror, probably terror, because I think it resonates more with Ukrainians than persecution, which is not in the Ukrainian criminal code. A campaign of terror, which consists of these constituent acts, which is designed to eliminate Ukrainian independence, identity, and so on. there's a theory of crimes. If we can get everybody working to that theory, it doesn't have to it doesn't have to define everything. Prosecutions at the end may be different to that, but at least everyone's looking for similar things. They're questioning the event in a similar way. They're asking, was that murder done in order to terrorize the population? Was it done to persecute? Was it done to persecute, and did the persecution turn to genocide? So that theory of crimes is necessary to coordinate everybody, and then the training of everybody will become much less ad hoc. It will become much more systematized, and you'll have across civil society and the prosecution similar standards. I make it sound easy, it's not, but it'll be easier than just continuing as Ukraine is at the moment, which are organizations like Hounds doing their best with little resources, frankly, to not only do their own investigations, but train up other organizations as well.
Yeah, hi, Adrian Karatnitsky with two of the co-sponsor organizations, Ukrainian Jewish Encounter and the Atlantic Council. And I was head of Freedom House in the US for about 15 years, but I am not a lawyer and an international expert. So I'm going to ask maybe a naive question. Wayne, in your remarks earlier, you spoke of sort of the chain of relationships that take it all the way to the top leaders. So for example, the top, at the very top, Putin. There is one phenomenon of recent months that I think has attracted a lot of attention, and that is the recruitment policy of the Wagner Group. As the Wagner Group is an integral part of the Russian military effort and is operating under Russian auspices, the fact of the recruitment and the mechanism by which these individuals were recruited from prisons presumably required either a legal act that would provide for their amnesty under certain conditions signed by the president, or an amnesty by the president in individual cases, again, implicating the president directly. So it seems to me that that may be one line of inquiry that Ukraine and others might pursue that could get to the heart of the matter and put him up against. So if, you know, there is some evidence that as many as 50% of the people now fighting around Bakhmut in the Wagner are people with criminal backgrounds. That seems to me to be a very negligent, and again, not an expert, but if you're taking violent criminals and putting them into a military setting, and then there are crimes, this is not just negligence, but this is a sort of a willful act that may give you a quicker path to the top. So your thoughts about that as a possible line of inquiry.
Okay, Wayne?
Okay,
I'm sorry, I'm not able to give you the word again, because I think we have to quit at 1 o'clock sharp. What can we conclude? The atrocities are so widespread, so different, so vast. The country is busy fighting back the invaders. Millions of people left, so it almost seems like a mission impossible to document at least a big amount of all the crimes that are happening. I think the second really important lesson is, so there must be patterns there. We must look for patterns, at least for the debate in international institutions, then international courts. And since we excluded our people who have been watching us online, at least I will be respectful enough to answer Nina Steininger, because she mentioned exactly that. She said, will you please talk about the atrocities in Chechnya and in both Russian-Chechen wars? And I think this brings it exactly to the point what Tom said and what you said. It's about patterns. It's not the first time. We should remember that also. Talk about Syria, we didn't do it. So I think it is time to understand for the international community. It's really time to understand and not fuss around anymore with the idea and the fantasy in the back head that one must have chances to come back to good terms. This is not possible with this regime, which is responsible for all what you're talking about. So thank you very much. Always you people coming from Ukraine, having such a long, long journey. And I know how difficult it is, how much time it eats up from, and you have so many important things to do, but we really need your testimonies so that we can work on in our capitals. And since it's the Atlantic Council, which means Washington, D.C., and since it's the Wallenberg Center, which is Canada, and the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, which is Canada also, I think we can really try to make this network stronger. This is our responsibility. Thank you all very, very much. Stay healthy, and your families, and I hope you don't lose anybody of your dearest persons in those terrible weeks which are still ahead of you. Thank you.